Do you see any of the real Diana in Meghan? Did you?
No.
Really?
No. Sorry. I don't want to be doing another bloody segment on Meghan Markle and Harry, right?
What looked like a routine live TV segment suddenly turned into a headline-making clash. The second Piers Morgan held up a stack of glossy photos of Meghan Markle for the audience to see. Viewers were expecting the usual political talk, but the mood changed in an instant. Instead of a normal panel exchange, the whole discussion shifted toward Meghan's carefully shaped public image. To critics watching at home, those photos did not feel random. They looked like snapshots from a world of status, private access, and polished connections that seemed very different from the softer, struggling actress story often repeated in public interviews. That is why the moment landed so hard. Meghan has spent years being framed as someone who pushed through setbacks, pressure, and rejection to build her life. But critics have long argued that parts of her story feel too neat, too managed, and too selective. Old blog traces, missing photos, faded friendships, and revised timelines have all been pointed to as reasons for doubt. So when those images appeared on screen, it felt to many people like the polished surface had taken a direct hit, and Piers did not need to overdo it. He did not shout, he did not grin, he did not turn it into a circus. He simply held the photos with that cold, steady calm that made the whole thing feel even more deliberate. It was not wild chaos from his side. It looked like a move he had been waiting to make. The reaction online was instant. Social media lit up fast, clips spread everywhere, and viewers began studying every detail in the images.
And all the racism claims turned out to be bullshit. The mental health claims were bullshit. All of it was bullshit, designed to damage and attack the royal family, the monarchy, and all of it. And it made me puke.
Once a Soho House basic, always a Soho House basic.
These were not treated like harmless throwback shots from some forgotten event. To the people already skeptical of Meghan's story, the photos looked like pieces of a lifestyle built around exclusivity, money, and elite circles that she would rather keep out of focus. That is where the real sting came in. Critics said the photos suggested a level of comfort in those spaces, not just a lucky appearance here or there. In several frames, Meghan appeared to be surrounded by wealthy men, connected social figures, and members of circles known for being selective. That visual alone was enough to set off a flood of questions. If Meghan truly lived the modest life she has sometimes described, critics asked, then how did she move through spaces that many people never get near? How did she gain entry into places tied to influence, image, and top-tier connections? Those questions were not driven only by gossip. They came from the impression created by the images themselves, and that impression spread fast. The atmosphere in the studio seemed to tighten as well. Even the co-hosts looked unsure whether they were watching a tough piece of media confrontation or a highly timed personal strike. That uncertainty added even more weight to the moment, because it made the reveal feel bigger than just a single TV segment. It felt like something that had been building behind the scenes for a long time. What made it even sharper was how Piers framed it. He did not present the reveal as a smear campaign. He framed it as setting the record straight. That phrase hit hard because it implied there was a deeper issue under the photos themselves. If the pictures were genuine and reflected parts of Meghan's past she had never fully addressed, then critics would argue that her public narrative was not just incomplete.
Are there any fans of Meghan Markle in tonight? Hang on. There is one lone hand has raised
subversive.
Here. Actually, that is one more than I expected, I have to be honest.
It was planned from the beginning. She denied being interested in the royal family, which she totally was. I know someone who knows the ex-husband who said she had a vision board with Prince Harry on it.
They would argue it had been carefully engineered. Even more striking to some observers was the silence that followed. Meghan's team is known for responding quickly when stories go too far or feel unfair, but critics noticed there was no immediate major denial, no loud correction, and no rapid counterattack attached to that specific moment. Whether that silence meant anything or not, it became part of the discussion almost immediately. Still, the photos alone were not the biggest mystery. The bigger question was who allegedly passed them to Piers Morgan and why. Because material like that does not simply float into public view on its own. Someone had access, someone had motive, and someone likely understood exactly how damaging the timing could be. That is why Piers' personal history with Meghan became such a key part of the story. Their connection did not begin with public warfare. By his own telling, their first interactions were warm and friendly. They exchanged messages, shared drinks at a Kensington pub, and he believed a genuine rapport had started. Then, according to him, that connection ended abruptly when Meghan stopped replying without explanation. The next part only made it more dramatic. Very soon after, Meghan was seen with Prince Harry, stepping into a far bigger and more powerful world than anything Piers could offer. To critics, that became the moment where a private slight slowly hardened into a public grudge.
This is what Meghan has been doing. She's a piece of Klingon, like she clings to somebody who can get her there. So Meghan manages to befriend one person of a very popular group, and then that person introduces her to the others. And because she's being brought in by somebody they trust, she's welcomed in.
But 57,000 people complained to the television regulator, Ofcom, in the UK. A world record, I'm proud to say, complained about me for not believing Princess Pinocchio. And eventually my boss had said, can you just apologise to Meghan Markle, or you're going to have to, maybe lose your job. I went, I'll take the job option, thanks, I'll leave. And I walked off into the sunset.
What may have started as bruised pride seemed to grow over time into something much more serious. Years later, Meghan's Oprah interview pushed that tension into a much wider media storm. Piers openly challenged her claims, and that clash became one of the biggest public flashpoints linked to her name. Reports later suggested Meghan made a formal complaint during that period, and Piers seemed to take that as more than a professional disagreement. He appeared to view it as betrayal. So when he displayed those photos on live TV, many people did not see it as random. They saw it as the latest move in a long-running battle built on resentment, rejection, and the belief that he had once been cut off and later punished for refusing to stay quiet. In that reading, the photos were not just content, they were ammunition, but even Piers may not have been the most interesting figure behind the drama. As the story spread, attention started moving toward another name that has quietly hovered around Meghan's rise for years: Marcus Anderson. Marcus has often been described as a powerful connector inside the Soho House world. Publicly, Meghan framed him as a friend, but critics have long suggested he may have played a bigger role than that. In their eyes, he was not just a companion.
He knows, and everybody all around the world, that you would want to know. The very rich, the very connected. Anybody who is anybody would be in Marcus Anderson's little black book. And he's never betrayed a confidence. He's never made a slip.
He was someone with serious reach, someone who understood elite social scenes and knew how the right introductions could change a person's status almost overnight. That theory kept growing because Marcus seemed to appear around key stages of Meghan's social climb. From Toronto to London and beyond, his name kept surfacing in the background. To online watchers, that pattern looked less like coincidence and more like a quiet strategy playing out behind the curtain. Fair or unfair, it made people wonder whether he had been a gatekeeper all along. And that matters because a person in that kind of role would likely have access to private lounges, exclusive events, guest lists, social photos, and behind-the-scenes moments that never made it into public view. That is exactly why some observers started asking whether the images shown by Piers came from somewhere inside Meghan's former circle rather than from an outsider. If that were true, it would give the whole story a darker edge. It would suggest not just outside criticism from old enemies, but a fracture from within. Somebody close enough to see the real machinery of that world may have decided to expose pieces of it. And if Marcus was not the source, critics argued, then somebody with a similar level of access may have been playing an even bigger game. As those leaked images kept circulating, another old line of speculation started rising again online. The long whispered yacht rumours that have followed Meghan for years. These stories never fully disappeared. They just hovered at the edge of public discussion, occasionally flaring up and then fading again. The reason they remain so charged is because they tie into the same broader picture that Meghan's critics keep pushing, not the image of a desperate actress barely scraping by, but of a woman moving through ultra-wealthy, invitation-only circles where luxury, access, and influence overlapped. In that version of the story, private yachts were not just glamorous escapes. They were described by commentators as floating networking spaces where wealthy businessmen, social elites, and ambitious rising women could all mix in a setting far away from cameras and public scrutiny. That idea has fueled years of speculation, even though many specific claims tied to Meghan remain disputed. Several writers and documentaries, including commentary linked to Kirby Summers, have discussed wider patterns involving rising actresses being invited to exclusive events under polished, high-end conditions. Meghan's name has often appeared around those online discussions, though many of the claims remain unverified and heavily argued over. That is exactly why this topic stays so explosive. It feeds on suggestion, image, and the public appetite for scandal. And that is where the story keeps getting more volatile, because once fresh leaked images collide with older rumours, the conversation stops being just about a TV reveal. It turns into a bigger question about what kind of world Meghan was really moving through before royalty, who helped shape her path, and how much of that story was ever meant to be seen clearly by the public, especially when some viral photos claiming to show her on certain yachts were later identified as other women. Here's the rewritten second piece with a longer flow, around 300 extra words added naturally, simple dramatic language, and a comment and subscribe ending. What kept this storm alive was not just one photo or one rumour, but how many timelines, locations, and anonymous claims seemed to overlap just enough to keep people talking. That is what drove the frenzy. Critics kept circling back to the same issue. Meghan's alleged access to luxury travel, exclusive vacations, and polished high-status spaces did not seem to match the modest, struggling image she later leaned on so heavily in public. To her critics, the contrast was just too sharp to ignore. If she really had such a difficult climb, they asked, then how did she end up in Mediterranean hotspots, elite social settings, and first-class experiences that most people could never casually afford? Who was opening those doors? Who was paying for what? And why did some of the same powerful-looking figures appear around those old images again and again? Those questions were not coming out of nowhere. They were being revived by context, by timing, and by the fresh attention created when those leaked photos allegedly hit the spotlight. And just when it looked like the speculation had already reached its peak, Prince Harry's own memoir pushed the conversation even further. When Spare came out, Harry likely meant it to be emotional, personal, and intimate. He was trying to tell a love story, explain his choices, and defend the path he and Meghan had taken. But to critics, parts of the book did something else completely. They seemed to shine light on areas of Meghan's past that had remained conveniently blurry for years. In several passages, Harry described Soho House almost like a familiar refuge in Meghan's world. He talked about early dates, quiet corners, private dinners, discreet meetings, and staff who appeared very comfortable with her routine. For most couples, details like that might sound sweet or romantic, but in this case, critics treated those lines like accidental clues, because Meghan had often given the impression that the club was more of a casual convenience than a central part of her world. Yet Harry's own words painted a very different picture. His version suggested comfort, familiarity, and deep roots in that environment long before their romance became public. And that single contrast reopened a whole stack of old questions critics had already been asking for years. How did she gain that level of access to a place known for exclusivity? How did she become so settled in a world many high-profile people struggle to break into? Why did her social circles seem so polished, so wealthy, and so strategically placed? Readers started noticing those details fast. And whether Harry meant to reveal too much or not, critics believed he had done exactly that. That is what made the memoir so damaging in their eyes. Harry sounded sincere, open, and even innocent in the way he described those early days. But that sincerity ended up clashing with the more carefully controlled public image Meghan had built. The result was a sharp contrast between the humble story and the lifestyle critics believed was hiding in plain sight all along. Once people started connecting those memoir details to the leaked photos Piers Morgan had shown, the story took on even more heat. Suddenly, it was not just about old images. It was about a pattern critics claimed pointed to selective storytelling, polished reinvention, and a public narrative that left out the most uncomfortable pieces. And then there was Meghan's response, or rather, the total lack of one. For a public figure known for pushing back hard when coverage turns hostile, that silence stood out in a major way. This is someone who has challenged press stories, objected to public framing, and fought over details large and small. Yet when photos and commentary surfaced that critics said cut straight into the heart of her public backstory, there was no major denial, no clear correction, and no obvious effort to shut the whole thing down fast. That silence got loud very quickly. Online, people immediately started asking why. If the images were fake, why not say so? If the claims around them were distorted, why not correct the narrative? Her critics treated the quiet like a red flag. Her supporters could argue it meant nothing. But in the middle of a media storm, silence becomes part of the drama, whether anyone wants it to or not. Some analysts suggested a response might have drawn even more attention to the photos. Others guessed the Sussex team may have been weighing the risk of addressing the issue versus letting it burn out on its own. But if that was the strategy, critics said it backfired badly. Ignoring the noise did not make it disappear. It made the mystery feel bigger. Social media threads multiplied. Commentators examined every image, every quote, every timeline, and every old connection. The more the story was left hanging, the more people filled the gap with speculation. The silence turned into its own headline, its own controversy, and to critics, its own sign that something about the past remained too messy to confront directly. That is why these leaks felt bigger than a one-day scandal. The deeper people dug, the more they claimed to see a repeated pattern: selective storytelling, strategic omissions, old circles disappearing, and a new version of Meghan emerging whenever the old one no longer fit the goal. To critics, this was not one isolated PR problem. It was part of a much longer reinvention cycle. Long before royal life, they argue, Meghan had already shown a habit of reshaping her image. The blog era faded, old friendships seemed to disappear, certain lifestyle details dropped out of sight. Former connections allegedly went quiet once new opportunities appeared. Each new phase came with a cleaner, sharper narrative, ready to replace the last one. And that is why the Soho House chapter refuses to stay buried. More than anything else, it represents a version of Meghan that critics say does not match the simple fairy tale storyline. The glamour, the exclusivity, the affluent circles, the high-level access. To them, it all points to a much more calculated climb than the one usually described in public. That is also why the leaked photos hit differently. They were not just awkward old snapshots to critics. They looked like reminders of a past that was never fully gone, only carefully trimmed, softened, and edited out of the final presentation. And once that kind of editing starts to unravel, critics believe the whole image can start shaking with it. So now the conversation is no longer slowing down. It is getting louder. Every old contradiction, every resurfaced connection, every silent moment, and every disputed rumour keeps feeding the same public curiosity. Critics do not see a past that disappeared. They see one that was managed, repackaged, and never fully erased. And while Piers Morgan's on-air reveal may have pushed the door open, critics say it is what sits behind that door that keeps the story alive. The shifting stories, the vanished friends, the upscale access, And the gap between the polished image and the more complicated version, people think they are only now starting to see. If you want the next layer of this drama, especially the family fallout and the emotional side of the story, watch the next video where Thomas Jr. speaks out on camera about Meghan and her ailing father. That piece connects directly to everything we covered here and adds a whole new level of tension you do not want to miss. Drop your thoughts in the comments if you think this silence says more than any statement ever could, and subscribe for more royal drama, deep dives, and hidden twists the headlines do not tell you straight.